Alright, so welcome back to another Everdell card strategies and synergies video. So we're going to be focusing on cards that utilize your workers better and also organize your town better. So let's get started talking about the cards from Everdell that will help you do that. Now there's not very many cards that let you do that, organizing your town and organizing your workers, but there are some, and these are the cards that we're focusing on. So let's talk about organizing your town better first. We'll talk about these later. Okay, so there's only two different cards here that let you organize your town. They're both good cards. They're still contingent on you even acquiring one of these, which is still slim. You're not always going to get one of these into your town every game. But there have been times where I've gotten both into my town, and man, talk about a well-organized town if you manage to get both of these into your town, especially if you get them into your town early in the game. Now, they do cost a lot of resources. They cost the same amount of resources, 1 resin and 2 pebbles. That's also the case. Now, the dungeon allows you to play a card for 3 resources fewer and into your town by discarding a critter or construction. When you play a construction card, you can place a critter into the dungeon, basically, face down beneath the dungeon, to play that card, construction or critter, for 3 resources of your choice fewer. Now, the reason why I didn't mention this in the video that talked about, the innkeeper and the crane, for instance, which lets you save resources. The reason why I didn't talk about it then is because this is about thinning out your town and trying to only put cards into your town that you want the most. Now, there are a lot of cards that you'll put into your town simply for resources. Like the twig bridge. It's worth only 1 point, but you get 2 twigs every time it's activated. Or the mine, although it still might be something you might want to discard because you get a lot of resources. There's going to be cards that you put into your town that give you a lot of resources, but later down the road, you might want to get rid of them. Now, this card doesn't do that. It doesn't get rid of the construction cards that you already have in your town. It only gets rid of the critter cards. So the cards that utilize the dungeon that you might have in your town that you might want to get rid of are going to be maybe the postal pigeon. You might have played this earlier to play a card for free, but now it's just sitting in your town, not giving you any points and taking up space. So the postal pigeon, might be a card worth throwing into the dungeon, okay? Now, many people think that the Fool is the best card to put into the dungeon. Somebody might give this to you, and you might want to put the Fool into the dungeon. You can only put up to 2 cards at most into the dungeon, and that's only if you also have the Ranger in your town as well. And while many people, especially players new to Everdell, will think that the Fool is the best card to put into the dungeon, and they might not want to put another card into the dungeon, there are a lot of other good cards that are worth putting into the dungeon. The Postal Pigeon is one of them. What's another good card that would be worth putting into the dungeon? Well, the Monk here is another good card that you could put into the dungeon. It gets you victory points every time you basically give berries to another player, but it's only worth 0 points at the end of the game, so it's taking up space, so you might want to throw your monk into the dungeon as well, maybe in autumn. Another good card is the Bard, because the Bard is also worth 0 points, but if you discard up to 5 cards, you get a point token for each. So you might have done this earlier in the game to get a bunch of point tokens, but now he's just taking up space in your city. So he's a good one to throw away into the dungeon as well. So that's 3 good cards already that are good cards to easily put into the dungeon that I do not worry about, that I do not care about, that I will definitely put into the dungeon any day of the week, especially if I don't have the Fool, okay? So that's 3 good cards, but then there's one more. If you're playing with the extra cards, the Juggler might have given you a lot of victory points, and we'll talk about the Juggler in another video, as well as the Monk and all that. But the point is, he's worth 0 points, and he's taking up space in your town, and if you want, cards that are going to give you the most points, this is something you might want to consider throwing in the dungeon as well if you played him earlier, the juggler. So, he wasn't that good at juggling, so throw him in the dungeon, right? And that's the point. There's lots of cards that you could potentially, there's lots of critter cards that you could put into the dungeon besides just the Fool. And they're not the only ones. There's a lot of critters that could be potentially worth putting into the dungeon. The Pirate, kind of Poetic Justice, is a good card you might want to throw into the dungeon. He's only worth 1 point at the end of the game, so he might be worth putting in the dungeon so that way you can play a card cheaper. And that's the whole point. The dungeon, you're throwing them in the dungeon so you can play cards cheaper. That's why you want to do that. Save your resources, or maybe you just don't have enough resources. So that might be somebody you want to throw away into the dungeon. Any of these, really, any of these green production cards that are just worth 1 point, that you already utilized, and as autumn now, you might want to throw the Peddler into the dungeon. Or the Miner Mole, you might want to throw him into the dungeon. Probably not the Chip Sweep, because the Chip Sweep at least is worth 2 points. But the Shopkeeper, you might throw him into the dungeon. Maybe you're not planning on playing any more critters. So hey, now the Shopkeeper, he was caught stealing, or he was caught giving his customers, expensive goods, overpriced goods or something like that. You might throw him in the dungeon. The Barge Toad, you could throw him into the dungeon. He's only worth 1 point. So the point is, there's a lot of critters you could potentially put into the dungeon. It doesn't have to be the Fool, okay? It doesn't have to be these 0 cards either that are critters. But you want to utilize your town as much as you can, and if you get the dungeon, you're going to want to utilize the dungeon as much as possible, especially if this is not a card you obtain. If you do not obtain the Ranger, you are definitely going to want to utilize something, and you might not always have the Fool to utilize. So these are some of the best ones you can throw into the dungeon that gave you tons of points to begin with, but now you're thinning out your town and you're trying to get the best cards you can get into your town as possible. That's basically what that dungeon is for. Now the university is going to do it for any critter or construction card. So any construction card that you have in your town that you want to get rid of, okay, it's a red destination card, so you still have to put a worker here. And if you can play this before autumn, you could potentially do this 2 times, maybe 3 times, okay? Maybe even 4 times, but not likely if you get this played in winter time. But if you discard a critter or construction from your city, you'll gain the resources for said critter or construction, plus an additional resource, and you get a point token too. So you're getting point tokens for it by utilizing it. Now you're probably thinking the ruins might be a good one to just get out of your town because you used the ruins to get all those resources earlier, and you would be right. If you have this in your town, it's still worth doing because you get a point token and you get resources, especially if this is the only card you have in your town you want to get rid of. This is still a good choice because technically you used the ruins earlier anyways to get tons of resources and draw cards, and now you're getting an additional point and an additional resource by getting rid of the ruins, freeing up a spot in your town. That's a potential good card to do. Another good construction card would be the cemetery here at the end of autumn. You might have utilized the cemetery 1 time, but now you don't want it in your town, and you still have this spot available for your worker. Now, it does not have an open sign, so you don't have to worry about another player coming here. But the point is, this might be another good card getting rid of because you get the resources back that you did to play this card, plus an additional one, plus a point token. So the cemetery is another good another good card that doesn't really give you any extra victory points for having in your town that you might want to get rid of with the university. But that's not it. That's not all. All of those construction cards that let you get resources also would be helpful, like the general store. You've utilized this to get tons of berries. Now it's autumn. Now it's not doing you any good. It's only giving you a point. Is it worth discarding this to get the resources back, plus another resource, plus 1 point? Yes, it is, because now you haven't lost a point. You haven't gained a point, but you haven't lost a point. And you've freed up a spot in your town, and you've gained resources, and you've gained another resource. So this is still a good card that's worth discarding after you've utilized it for everything you can. Or the farm. another good card to discard from your town when you no longer need it. Of course, if you're doing the wife-husband strategy, you might want to hold on to that farm. The Resin Refinery is another good card you might have utilized, and now it's autumn, and so now you might want to get rid of it with the university. But remember, you can only have one of these in your town, and you can only have one worker here, so you're only going to be able to get rid of one card, one of these 1-point cards anyways. But maybe earlier on you could get rid of that Ruins if you had it, or even that Clock Tower. That's another good card that could be helpful too, that Clock Tower, because remember, if you remember correctly, the Clock Tower, it might only be worth 1 point at the end of the game because you've utilized it for its ability. Or it might not be worth any points at all at the end of the game. So you might want to think about discarding the Clock Tower later down the road too. That's a good strategy, doing that too with the Clock Tower. So that's another good card that could be very helpful, of course. So then, there's just a lot of good cards you could potentially discard with the university, getting some point tokens along the way, and getting some resources to boot, and getting the resources back that the card cost. Could potentially also be the case, right? So that's basically it. And what I want to talk about, if you manage to get one of these 2 cards, these are going to organize your town a whole lot better for sure. So if you can get one of these, that's great. If you can't, well, then obviously that's going to happen. And even if you can't get these cards, that does not mean you should not play any of these cards into your town either. It's still worth doing that for the Bard, for sure. It's still worth trying this for the Juggler. It may not be worth it for the Monk, but it's still potentially worth it for the Postal Pigeon, even if you don't get any of these cards. So that's it for those 2 cards, but there's still some more. There's the other 2 cards I want to mention in this video. The Clock Tower and the Ranger. Now, you only have so many workers, okay? And these cards will help you basically utilize your workers and organize them better, because the Ranger allows you to move one of your deployed workers to a new location. So in a sense, you're basically getting 1 extra worker for 1 season. It is a unique critter, so you can't have more than one of these in your town. Now, I did see a player do this once. He didn't realize he was going to get a second one, but he had the dungeon, okay? He had the dungeon, and he played the Ranger for free, and he got to utilize the Ranger to basically move a worker to another location for getting resources or something, right? And then he threw the Ranger into the dungeon later. Then, later on, he drawed another Ranger, and he played it, and got to get another worker. That is a possibility of something that could potentially happen. It's not likely, but it is something to consider. That it still might be worth doing, especially if you get another Ranger down the road. But you can't rely on that, and he just happened to luck out, I think. But that is something you could potentially do with the Ranger, or the dungeon for that matter. So, but yeah, you're going to get one of your deployed workers, and you're going to get to move them once. But the best card is the Clock Tower, especially if you play this in spring. If you manage to play it in winter, even better. If you play it in winter, you're going to utilize all the point tokens. What you do is when you play the Clock Tower, and it does cost a lot of resources, so make note of that, but when you do play it, you get to put 3 point tokens on the Clock Tower. And then, when you prepare for the next season, so when you prepare for, if you play this in winter, and you prepare for winter, you may pay 1 point token from the Clock Tower to activate one of your basic or forest locations where you have a worker deployed. In a sense, you're getting to utilize one of your workers. You're basically getting to place out another worker, if you think of it that way. But you're not getting to place it in a new location like with the Ranger. You're getting to activate one of the locations you're already at again, which is powerful. You're not always going to get this card, but if you can get it in the beginning of the game, it is super fantastic. If you get it in winter, and I have gotten it in winter many times, then you're going to utilize it for spring, possibly summer, possibly autumn. That means by autumn, this will be worth 0 points. And then, like I said, it might be something you might want to discard later with the university, or with that Ruins that we talked about earlier. That might be a good card to utilize with the Clock Tower later down the road, once you've utilized it for its ability. But even if you just get it in the spring, that's still getting to activate it in summer and autumn. And that'll still leave 1 point token there. And it still might be worth utilizing the university or the ruins with the clock tower. That is something. But yes, that's powerful. That's a good card right there. This card is one of the best cards there is. And it's definitely still better than the Ranger, regardless of the case. Because this is a one-time thing, and you're not likely to get another Ranger. Like I said, that was luck. And this, you get to potentially do it up to 3 times, potentially. That's a lot better than the Ranger still. So that's it for this video. So I hope you guys liked this video. If you guys liked this one, don't forget to leave me a like. And I'll see you guys again in the next video.